Good afternoon, everybody. How are we?
Thanks.
Thanks. So if you've been to one of the previous three workshops, just can you click the reaction sign on your on the bottom of your tab, so we'll just see who's back for more and who's here for the first time. Okay, so most of us have been here before. So that's good. So we're going to, this is now the fourth of 14 workshops that we're running nationally around a native seed sector strategy. My name's JP Van Wart. So we're going to change the order a bit like we did this morning and get really into the details around, specifically around securing supply. And then there are some broader strategy questions that sit over the top. And those of you who've been participating in those sections beforehand, you're more than welcome not to hang around for that, because there will be a rinse and repeat in what you've done. You're quite welcome to contribute to that, but I think it's not necessary. So there's just some context around that. But anyway, welcome to workshop 3. This is a workshop that's part of Project Phoenix, which is an initiative that came out of the bushfires, and it's about how we can grow and develop the native seed sector strategy in Australia. And I'm working with Project Phoenix, as is my colleague Laura Baker, who's on the screen, to help write the strategy and pull it together. And we've spent the last couple of months working through a process of framing it up. And then these workshops are really about looking at the strategy from what's going to work in each individual jurisdiction, as well as what are the issues around particular themes, and today's theme being supply. So basically what I'd like to do as an icebreaker is what I'd like you to do is to use the chat box, and the chat box is very important in these workshops, and after this we'll get into the introductions. But I'd like you to just quickly write down, what do you think the biggest issue is around securing supply? Just chuck in a one-liner. What's the biggest issue in relation to supply? So harvesting, says Claire. Land tenure, says Alexandra. Lack of production area, says Alistair. Lack of seed collectors, says Rowena. Methods of harvesting, says Stephen Bruce. I'm getting hold of the amounts that I need, says Emma. Secure supply, consistent quality, says Darren. Continuity year from year to year, says Paul Miller. Access to land. Scarcity of some species in agriculture areas, lack of seed production areas, says Martin. Good stuff. Okay, I'll just do a bit of an introduction now so that everybody can see the context of the process we're going to go through, and then we'll get into it. So basically, today is really about 3 things. It's about working on the purpose of the strategy, looking at the opportunities and challenges around securing supply, and then considering the lens of governance. But we're going to open up really by focusing on the second one here, which is the opportunities and challenges that lie around securing supply. So that's, as a workshop, just as a process that we're going to go through, is we're going to look at supply through the 5 pillars that were in the discussion paper. We'll have a short discussion around quality. And those of you who've been in previous workshops, you can stay around for the governance and challenge and comms. But if you feel you've had your say around that, please feel welcome. But I encourage the ones of you who haven't participated in a workshop to hang around for the last 3 items on the agenda. There's about 24 people online today, so we're going to be using breakup rooms in groups of 6, so everybody gets to have a say. We'll be using the chat box a lot, so please familiarise yourself with that. And as always, be succinct, no need to repeat, and respect differences and processes. We're also just going to capture a few polls along the way so that everybody, we can just get a bit of a vox pop on where people are at a different point in time. So securing supply. So basically, there's 3 things that have come up in the framing of the strategy that are very important, of which security and supply is one. The other 2 are about targeted building of capacity and also getting a more coordinated and sustained demand signal running. So demand and supply are very linked around this, and there's a workshop tomorrow on demand, but this afternoon we're looking at it through the lens of supply. To give you some context, when we're talking about supply, I suppose we're really talking about 3 things. We're talking about the sources of seed, the stores of seed, and the suppliers of seed. And so in the wild, we know we can source seed from the public estate, Indigenous lands, and private property. And there are conservation banks, seed production areas, and commercial seed banks that exist out there. And then the suppliers themselves are a mixture of not-for-profit organisations, commercial businesses, public organisations, and trading enterprises. So this goes to various users and enablers, but really, you know, this afternoon we're just looking at these first 3 columns that are here: sources, stores, and suppliers. So we're going to look at it through the lens of the 5 pillars. Now, these pillars we developed early on in the process, and we've gone through a process of expanding and validating them with people. And they seem to be holding the test of time. So if we think about supply, we've got this about information provision. So, you know, where can I get native seed from, and who is it, and who can I get it from? There are quality aspects around it. And there's quality access, there's quality around both the quality of the seed that's collected and then how it's stored. And there's also a regulatory system associated with accessing seed, particularly when it's required from public or private or Indigenous lands. And then we saw that in the opening chats. So some of the ideas that people were sharing is about knowing how to do it, who to get to do it, so capacity issues. And obviously there's more we can do around this to make it better. But what we're going to do as a group now in securing supply is basically, we've got to juxtapose these 2 things against each other. So we have the sources, the stores, and the suppliers, and then you've got information provision, quality standards, and smarter regulation, capacity building, research and development. So how do these things come together, and what can we really do to secure improved supplies of native seeds, both in terms of sources and stores, and also developing the supplier market itself? So what I'd like to do now is we'll quickly drive into breakout groups. This is also a chance for you to introduce each other and just make sure that see where everybody's coming from. And what I'd like you to do is reflect upon these 3 questions and draw out the discussion over about the next 20 minutes. And or maybe if you're going well, we'll go a little bit longer. So first of all is, how can we improve the seed sourcing from the various, from the public estate, Indigenous lands and private property? How can we improve the number of different types of seed banks that are out there? And what are the challenges and opportunities do seed suppliers face? So Laura's going to copy the first 2 questions and put them into the chat room so you can see it, and we'll break and we'll have a discussion around the first 2. Then we'll come back and reflect upon that, and then we'll look at it through the lens of the individual enterprises that are involved. So in our discussion here, what we're aiming to do is to really look through the pragmatics of sources and seed banks, or sources and supplies, and then we'll talk about the dynamics of how individual enterprises deal with this challenge. And we've deliberately split the 2 up because one's a functional view and one's essentially an organisational view, and the dynamics are slightly different. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and Laura will put those 2 things into the question box. So the process from here is that you go into your room and discuss those two questions for about 20 minutes. Just as before we go into it, and many of you have been part of the discussion beforehand now, does any, either unmute and ask a question, or if you just need some clarification, could you just quickly raise your hand in the reaction button so we can just make sure everybody's clear about what we're doing? So Adele, you had a question?
No, no question.
Oh, sorry. Wonderful. All right. Well, James will now send us to our individual discussion groups. Laura and I will be jumping in and out of them. Yeah, we'll get into it, and I'll see you all in 20 minutes' time. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry to cut off the discussion, but I thought we'd just touch base and take stock, and then we'll go back to our breakout rooms and unpack it a bit more, because some of the groups were sort of getting to the end of the discussions and other ones were just starting. So what I'd like you to do is now spend a minute and just sharing your key reflection from the discussion you had with some of the other people in the sector over the last couple of minutes. And it could be a barrier, it could be an opportunity, it could be a particular thing, it doesn't really matter. But what's your key reflection around securing supply that you got out of the 20-minute discussion you had with other people? Again, just use the chat line at the bottom of the box here, and then we'll come together and then we'll debrief on the points that people have raised. So Emma's opened up with lack of collectors. Lucy said she can't store recalcitrant seeds. Joanne says, you know, the incentives for educating buyers about time, different permit requirements, regular work for seed collectors, land tenure, permission, getting to scale with SPAs, variability of supply, storage and banking. Seed farms, collectors, over collection, coordination, lead times again, networks, variability, so around the ways to collect seed, provenance limitations. Shelf life, the natural heritage conditions. Okay, I now want to cast it open to us as a group as a whole. And so there's a couple of key themes that seem to be coming up. One is about the collectors. And particularly it seems to be, I just want to put this proposition to you, is the critical issue around the collectors the actual lack of work that provides the incentive for people to be collectors? Is that the key issue? What do people think? And just unmute and anybody can speak.
I would just start from my experience. It's the fact, unless you've got continuity of employment, that the collectors are then involved in either direct seeding or revegetation or vegetation management in the off season. The continuity of supply cuts a lot of, or this continuity of work cuts people out.
Are most seed collectors part-time or are they full-time?
Sorry.
Go on.
Martin, no, please. Martin.
No, Marina, no, people hear enough of me.
No, they don't, Martin. I can't hear enough of you. Could I just say, we are a seed company and a nursery, and what we do is we employ people obviously in the nursery, and then when the crops come that we need to collect, we all go and collect. That's how we manage seed collection staff, is they are part of the nursery system as well.
Thank you, Marina.
Yep.
Martin.
We do the same. We have a separate company that does revegetation on mine sites and other places. And so the employees are then switched out through that period of time and then come back to collecting, cleaning, and doing all those tasks.
And if I could just say, with this affiliation with Bush to Bowl, the Aboriginal people, we are also, as I've been trying to many years, to incorporate Aboriginal people to help us seed collect. And one way of doing that is, again, incorporating Aboriginal people here in the nursery to work in the nursery to help us seed cleaning and help us do the seed collection and all of that sort of thing.
So what do people have other views on the collectors and where some of the challenges, but also where some of the opportunities lie?
One of the other things is that at least some of the collection is really laborious and it's, you know, hot and uncomfortable and all the rest of it. And, you know, in seed production areas, mechanisation and, you know, I've said for many years, you know, there's no need to make it more difficult than it needs to be. And I think, you know, no one gets out with a scythe anymore to harvest wheat. And I think we need to look at that whole mechanisation and efficiencies and all sorts of things. But that doesn't lend itself to wild harvest, but it does to seed production and that sort of thing. Mechanisation, at least it moves from being cottage to industry and looking after staff as well. You know, like a lot of people have said to me over the years, it must be lovely.
Romantic.
Give it a basket. And I said, well, you come with me when it's 49 degrees and a howling wind and I'll tell you how lovely it is.
Precisely.
So,
But still in our still in our blood though, Martin. We'll go out, we'll get fit.
Exactly. You see the outcome.
And when I collect, I'm a wombat. When I get it off the ground, I'm a kangaroo, and I'm getting it from there. So it's these things that just make you keep going.
So Cameron, what do you think the challenge is around, what the opportunities are around collectors from your perspective?
Well, I don't think many people know it's a thing. I wish I'd have known. 12 months ago, I didn't even know the industry existed, and I've been in agriculture all my life. So agriculture is not directly related, but it's certainly adjacent. And you know, I wish I'd have known it was a thing when I was in first, second, third year at college. Uni holidays would have been a great way to make some money. So there's that. There's just the profile, and then I think it's just economics. And if someone who's unskilled doesn't need much kit. So if you've got a ute and a bit of other gear, and you've got land access, if you can make a couple of $100,000 a year, I think it's a great opportunity. And I do understand what the people who are more experienced in the game are saying, but I also think, you know, those people that have got a bit of drive about them, it's a great opportunity to make some money.
Well, they're the people we worry about, people who think that they can make money easily. They'll grab the ute and they'll go bush, and they cause a lot of damage. We are quite wary of people like that, because I know it sounds easy, and I know there's such a romanticism about collecting seed. I've heard it so many times, but we are very frightened of people like that, because they don't know the ramifications. They'll see a crop of something, they'll go in, I've seen it, they'll cut it down, they'll destroy the area, and they'll move on. And half the time the seed isn't quite ready to collect. So,
yeah, well, I think that's where the previous discussions come into play, JP, around accreditation.
Yeah.
And making sure that those quality standards are met. I'm talking more, and I've just, at 12 o'clock, I had a 2-hour phone conversation with the University of Queensland, talking to them about getting access to some of their Hort students to get them involved. Because I think there's an opportunity there, and I'm sure there's roads have been trod before, but technology is always evolving. People are getting access to things like knuckle booms these days. So, you know, machinery's evolving, technology's evolving, and this creates opportunities. And so I think that I don't have all the answers, but
you don't have any answers.
Cameron, I think you also raise a really good point that people don't know that this even exists.
Yeah.
The fact that the universities themselves, in training and ecological training, seed collectors, they're still talking about planting individual trees with shovels and doing restoration and this sort of stuff. The technology and stuff, as you say, has moved on. There is a whole lot of things there that TAFEs, universities and others, it's not incorporated in the training. A whole notion of, you know, using technology and tools and applications is not there. And that's because, like you say, it's invisible. It's just not out there. People don't see it as a field of endeavour or a career path, or we don't necessarily want the people with the old beat up ute. We want the people with the smarts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
I keep thinking, in the collection space, I keep thinking about where the kangaroo shooting industry was 20 years ago, where, you know, as Marina says, any wombat that had a ute and a rifle could head out and shoot roos off the side of the road. And then they brought in all the tags and the regulations around the vehicles had to be all stainless steel, and codes of practice and all this sort of thing, and it smartened the whole industry up. Now, you know, I feel as though it's a barbaric way to look at it, but I feel as though there's some similarities there.
I think
one of those similarities is in the fact that it's all well and good for somebody to go into the bush and, you know, with limited training and all the rest of it, they've only got to misidentify the tree or the plant that they're collecting. They've only got to, so what the point I'm trying to make is that without the data to go with the seed, it's just a bag of stuff. It doesn't matter what you've got. I wouldn't pay a penny for anything that was bought that did not have the data attached. And that's, you know, that it's just critical. There's no room for people to be walking in off the street with, you know, I mean,
There's got to be access points into the industry, and I think that's where the previous discussions around training and accreditation come in, Joe.
Yeah, so look, I think the identification is obviously critical. But if it doesn't have a profile, how do people know this work exists? It's another key thing that's coming on board. I also think the analogue to roo shooting is quite accurate, because one of the things that also happened with the roo shooting industry is the demand fell out of it for a while as well. And so one of the things we have been talking about is that it's getting a clearer signal of demand, of which there's a session on tomorrow. But the other thing I want to discuss in the plenary session now, when everybody's here, is what to degree is the limited number of sites. Do we have too few sites to access seed from in the wild? And we'll talk about SPAs in a second, but what about accessing seed in the wild, both from public and private lands? Do you feel that you're constrained as an industry not being able to access enough sites?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. We
So
don't
just to-
have enough trust from our government departments, basically.
So, can we just do a quick vox pop on that? If you feel that you've got constrained to wild harvest sites, can you do a thumb up on the reaction tab, please?
Can I just add a rider to that, though, that roadsides, from the data I have, roadsides are overexploited in New South Wales for seed collection and harvest, and that does put pressure on minimal areas, and everyone knows those roadsides and where things are. That's
right, because we're allowed to, by law, 5 metres either side. That's why we're so constricted. That's why we're doing all of that. We need more freedom.
I either need bigger roadsides or...
So what is it that constrain? Oh, Rowena, you've had your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Can I just ask, how does everyone feel about a peak industry body to represent the native seed sector in Australia? It's never been done before. Why can't it be done?
I thought that's why we were here.
I think that's the general view, Rowena, that ultimately we need to be moving that direction. It's just the process and how we get there.
It's easy.
Tell me.
Please elaborate, Rowena.
I'll tell you. No, I'll tell you I'll talk to you later about it, Martin. But there is the opportunity there for the seed sector to have its own peak industry body, and they'd be represented, you know, within government, I suppose we call it. And we could put together a code of practice for seed harvesting, talk to government about access rights to properties, Crown land, national parks, things like that. My dad assisted in writing the Flora Bank documents 30 years ago, I think, when they were written.
Yep.
So I've got a bit of background with that. So I'm happy to talk to you later on about.
Well, Rowena, it's really timely. You may not be aware, I suspect you're not aware, that the Flora Bank guidelines are currently being rewritten in draft form. I thought you were on a mailing list to receive some of that, but you're more than welcome to see the updated Flora Bank guidelines as they stand at the moment. Lucy Commander, who's on this call now, is involved?
sorry, we've hijacked the
Those?
discussion. We'll, yep, I can send them through.
Yeah.
Email me. So the old Flora Bank Code of Practice, I think a lot of people are still using, and we're updating.
And the new
based on
code
the
is,
new-
is part of that. So there is a code of practice in draft form
Yeah.
for use. And I believe that that is a great starting point for the National Code of Practice. If people see it as being applicable, we're putting it up there for that very purpose.
Actually,
Thank you. I look forward to reading it, Lucy. Thank you.
We'll make sure you get it, Rowena. I thought you already were on the list anyway. Right.
Please make sure I'm on the list too.
All right. So, so in terms of sites, what is it that's limiting your access to these sites?
Permission.
From who?
National parks mainly. Councils are wonderful because they want the seeds. So I always get permission from councils very, very easily. National parks is just impossible. And I've heard that from many seed collectors. National parks have to help us work within these parameters. And national parks also need to realise we love the bushland and we don't like to be treated as if we don't.
Great, thank you, Marina. What do other people think? What constrains your access to sites?
The cost, the royalties, the licence, the permits.
So this is the permit you need to pay the government.
Yep.
Correct, and that makes it also difficult because half the time you don't know what licence, what permit, what this, what that. It takes so much time to find out what we need to do it legally that by the time that you just either forget or the cops are done.
It's such an arduous and unclear process in New South Wales, and it's not dissimilar in Victoria, and the reporting requirements are disastrous.
So what about people in others outside of New South Wales? And I think the challenge in New South Wales is reasonably well documented and understood. Do people face other constraints in other states around Australia?
Yeah, we have problems with the decline of vegetation. So, you know, if roadsides get hit for a few times over a decade, they tend to deteriorate. Some things naturally decline anyway. Eucalypt trees become taller as the bottom branches get lopped, and so on and so on. So availability of seed becomes an issue.
Thank you.
If I can comment, Jay Wild here just joined. If I can comment on one particular place I have personal experience of, I was collecting on bush heritage land with their permission, and we were considering going across with their permission, going across into the adjacent national park. They applied and inquired for the permits to do it, and it wouldn't have been possible to obtain them before the seed dropped on the ground. It wasn't feasible from National Parks, New South Wales.
Right, fair. Any other comments from other states in Australia?
So here in WA, our collectors don't even try to get access to national parks. It's far too difficult. There's far too many regulations and restrictions. The seed would need to be used for very particular reasons. It might be if it's for scientific research or something like that. So where our collectors are generally limited to private property or certain types of reserves or council land.
Great, thank you, Bryony.
Yeah, I think also in WA, it's the level of land clearing can have an impact. So that really limits where you can collect from if there's only a few remnants, versus if you can collect in larger areas of the rangelands that are less impacted by land clearing. So like the level of urban development, for example, that's happening, it's possible that areas that could be collected from are disappearing.
Great, thank you, Lucy. What about collecting from private lands? Is it actually the fact that there are lack of remnants on private lands, or is it about having to negotiate with individual landholders?
For me, it's able to negotiate with individual landholders because half the time they're not home. They've got these beautiful farms. So you need to find them, which is very difficult to find a farmer during the day. You might be able to find him 6 o'clock in the morning when he's just getting out of bed. But other than that, he's on his land. You can't find them. You don't know how to access their permission, basically.
Great, thank you, Marina. Any other people would like to make a comment on accessing private seed from private land?
We often,
Personally, I have no problems obtaining from private land permission. I just go and I usually know them because they're a neighbour or a distant neighbour. No problems personally.
Sorry, Steve, you're going to say something.
we usually form relationships when we go out and do a job. So we'll collect off quite a few of our customers' country. We have agreements with quite a few mines to have access to their biodiversity offsets, and that's usually a condition of their operation anyway. So it would be nice to have more opportunity, but I suppose it comes down to, we also get pulled up a lot and people saying, what the heck are you fellas doing, tearing the bush to pieces and all this sort of stuff, you know, so we get challenged quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it's probably got to do with the fact that we're not a very, you know, the industry itself is not high profile. People don't drive past and go like, oh, there's some people there collecting some seeds. They think that you just...
Exactly, Steve. But what recently happened to me is we were collecting seed. The fellow stopped and said, oh, well, what you're doing is great. Come to my place. He showed us all around his property. We collected seed off his property. It was just gold.
Yeah, those experiences are out there.
Yeah, they are.
All right, and finally, sorry, Michelle, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it's a real win-win if you can collect on private lands. That's what I've mainly been targeting up here. And people, you know, I go and I you know, engage the landholders with what's on their land, finding all these trees, you know, really special trees they didn't know were there, and then they end up wanting to collect a bit of seed themselves and propagate and start re-vegging their properties, and they connect with other people around them, and yeah, it's just had a really good positive ripple effect, you know, just having that confidence to knock on the door and say, you know, can I come? Yeah.
All right, thank you. And do you have to compensate the private landowners?
Often they just really enjoy the fact that you love their land and what's on it.
Yeah, we pay a royalty.
Okay.
I'm never collecting in such large numbers that they're worried about it. You know?
No, it's always a few handfuls, isn't it?
And they're always just so excited by all the information that they're getting about it, that I think that's kind of the win that happens.
All right, and thank you. And finally, Indigenous lands. Do people have partnerships with Indigenous communities about collecting off Indigenous lands?
Slowly. We do have our local people here where they've given us permission to collect the seeds, but we would like to make sure that continues in much wider field.
What about others?
Yeah, I'm working with two Aboriginal groups that want to establish a seed collection process and capacity, mainly initially for their own re-veg requirements on their own lands, but to offer both seed and services to adjoining landowners.
Myself and Dave Carr have been training people over the years, and probably 50% of them have been Aboriginal, and they have some of them are really switched on. There's a group up at Guyra that really want to continue this process and start collecting the seeds and what have you. But you know, they need to be brought into this process, because I don't think that they want ownership of what they're doing, and that's right. That they need to have that, but it's probably not going. I don't know how that would work in a commercial sort of relationship.
I'll just go back to a little bit, because I think it's the same with non-Indigenous landowners. There is a lot of lands, private lands, agricultural lands, that because they've been overcleared, there isn't the capacity for collection there, but there are people who are receptive to putting in plantations of seed production for growing seed, initially for their own and collective use around them, but use down the track. And some of them want some recompense, some of them don't, because they're just keen on the cause. But I think there is a whole range of different models for access on private land, because in some areas it isn't that there's vegetation there, but there's land there.
So that's a nice segue, Martin, to seed production areas. There was a lot of investment in seed production areas under the National Heritage Trust in the noughties. And obviously, as an industry sector grows inside of that, you begin to see moving away from wild harvest to sort of more controlled environments, which is the seed production area and native seed. What I'm really interested in, what we're interested in understanding around seed production areas is what's it going to take to get more seed production areas up? And are they really integral to the solution, or do we think we'll need to continue to rely on wild harvest primarily?
Can I just add a little bit of background to that too? When we say there's been a lot of investment in the 90s on seed production areas, there was a lot of investment for production of seed, but I don't believe a lot of it, because the funding was not by necessity, because it was short-term funding. Investment didn't actually go into seed production areas because the groups knew that they weren't going to get the outcomes from that seed.
Oh, good point.
Invested, a lot of it was subterfuge in funding and supporting things like the TSR managements in New South Wales. The actual physical capacities for seed banks in various areas, but the actual seed production areas, and that's shown up in the audit that I've done. I've gone through all the projects in New South Wales that were funded for seed production, in inverted commas, and a lot of them were either management of areas of grassland, grassland for areas that were managed for seed production. They weren't established. There's only about 35 or 40 seed production areas for shrubs established across New South Wales. A few trees, but again, people didn't put in seed production for trees. The very fact that trees are going to take much longer to yield the seed, and people can't see the benefit in that unless they're got long-term control and long-term funding. So, I think it's a mistake to assume that there was huge amounts of investment in seed production areas. There was some investment, some were long-term, and they still operate.
Thank you. How important are seed production areas, and what do other people think?
We've got a seed production area. It was planted 30 years ago. Some of the species we're just starting to yield from in the last 5 to 10 years because of drought and what have you. But now the species that we planted back then that were in fad, popular, used for certain timber, whatever, they're not being used anymore. So I don't need to go and pick any more Eucalyptus pulverulenta because, the floristry market's moved away from that variety. And so that's the problem that we've seen with anything we plant. We know that we're looking at least 3 to 7 years before we can yield from it. So you've constantly got to be looking at other varieties that you can put in. And most of the things, like I said, are fads. They come and go through the industry. So it's really hard to sort of pinpoint, even a dozen varieties and say, well, we'll plant that knowing in 10 years' time we're going to be able to yield the seed. So that's a difficult one for us because they take up a lot of time to grow a lot of space if they're trees and shrubs. So staple ones for us are Banksias, Waratahs, you know, Dodonias and a few other species. But most of the time I can't see the value in using that land on something like Lomandra where it grows everywhere.
But that's the same issue is with intermittent funding for the conservation programs, where the species are probably constant, but the funding's variable. It's just the counterpoint of the same problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
But we're encouraging the major players to actually put them in themselves. I'm not going to put them in. I mean, I don't mind developing them, but I'm not going to buy land and then put down.
I want to spend my super on buying some land and putting in the species that you normally get from the bush, like the Pultonillas, the Dulwinias, all of those species that I know, Rowena, seeds are such a fashion, but as you say, you've got some tried and true seed crops, and the ones I want to put in are those species that people want to put into their gardens, like our gorgeous Dulwinias and all that sort of, all those crops that I've just mentioned. And that's what I want to put into my seed farm, so I don't have to go in the bush and collect. I just find that's really not a good way to go anymore.
Thanks.
So we've got a number of seed production sites in our area, in Victoria, in our catchment. And in 2012, we were lucky enough to get a biodiversity fund up and for $1 million to set up seed production sites. So that really was quite substantial for us to prioritise species for our catchment, prioritise what gets used, what quantities we needed, what species, where's the demand basically, isn't it? So where's the demand in your catchment? And from there, we've been able to set up on council land, on private land. Some of the private landholders, we then purchase that seed back off them. It's like giving them a longer term goal or understanding of where the industry is going and what.
We can lead them, correct.
Yes, so you sort of set it up that, okay, we're in here partnering with you for a long term. You may not, you always say, you may not make a lot of money, but you might just make something back and you're doing good for the greater good. So, you know, it definitely improves efficiency in collection, improves genetic diversity. You're getting collections from all those wild populations, putting them all together and having a great little genetic patch that you're able to collect off. Then after that, the seed that comes off, which we call the gold seed, that then goes into the next generation of seed production. So you set it up again, and you're just setting up these populations that are maximising that adaptation potential as well, rather than going out the bush, spending how many kilometres are you driving around the bush trying to find something that's actually ripe at the right time.
An animal does not know what provenance is. They don't care.
So thank you, Jim. Now Emma had her hand up before, but I missed her, so it's a while ago. But Emma, do you want to raise your point, please?
Yeah, I was just wondering, just before when we were talking about what are the things that limit collectors in actually getting access to land and that sort of stuff, and clearing and different things, is reliable spatial information of vegetation communities and distributions. Is that something that is also limiting to people? Like, if I know that here in the ACT we're a little bit lucky that we're so tiny that we had quite a large project a number of years ago, and we've done really highly reliable vegetation mapping, community descriptions and vegetation mapping across the whole of the ACT. I don't know how we existed and everyone did all the things that they did before without it. It's so useful in so many different aspects. But yeah, is that something that in other regions or states, if there was, you know, I know there is good mapping in some places, but if there was better widespread spatial information, would that help? You could target areas better or anything like that?
Look, for years I have been harping on, and Jim may support me, that Victoria and New South Wales, northern Victoria and southern New South Wales developed regional vegetation guides to give you the veg profiles of what's there, but that in relation and in conjunction with spatial information gives you both the species lists and localities. Also things like surveys of all roadsides, and a lot of councils have done this as part of their natural plans, surveys of all your roadsides and documentation of what's where, and management plans for that also helps with localities of where things are, but it also, unless there's coordination, it imposes risks on those things of over-harvesting if you're promoting where they are. So the tools are really important, but without coordination and management, the risk of over-exploitation is also there.
Yeah,
And
we
also-
again in the ACT, we've got the luxury of having that level of control, I guess. So our vegetation community data is very comprehensive, and it is publicly available. And we were lucky to do the community description in conjunction with New South Wales OEH for the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment. Unfortunately, they lost their funding then for their mapping component, so we remain a hole in a donut. But when we're talking more about those, you're talking about the species or communities that may have more pressure on them because they're restricted or threatened. We actually have that information available publicly, but it is buffered, and it's only available to select people, I guess.
So looking at the chat line, Emma, people are saying yes, they do agree with you that there's a lot of information there, but that it's also quite disaggregated. Is what some of the things that are coming through on the chat line. So look, we've had a good discussion about this for an hour, and there's some other things to get on with. So I just want to draw the discussion around to this, and then we're going to move on into quality itself. But any closing comments that people would like to make?
I did just want to say the importance of seed banks, a coordinated seed bank that is like your one-stop shop in the middle of a region, that any re-veg industry, any consultants, contractors can all just have that buffer as the group that are looking after all the regulations, or at least are having dialogue with government about all those issues that everyone has, the seed collectors and so forth. You know, you've got that seed bank that's really strong, and that's the buffer that identifies the need can work with the seed production world.
So yeah, it's a good point there. Sorry, you're just breaking up a bit there, Jim. But the question I got for you is, by seed bank, you mean like a physical store of seeds? Is that right?
Yes, a physical location that is coordinating whatever, whether it's government grants that are coming through, that they're coordinating that supply and demand for seed.
Yeah,
for the long term.
It's the system as well, isn't it? That it's not just the physical bit; it is the system and the staff and the resources that are all integrated at that regional level, which is the important thing.
Can I just make a point? The International Seed Federation has a tree and shrub group, which I'm a member of, and each year we can put forward species that we have available for sale throughout the world of tree and shrubs. Obviously, it's more prevalent through the Northern Hemisphere with pine seed and things like that, but that's something that could also be utilised for Australia as well to help connect, I suppose, people looking for seed, especially for provenance collection. So that's just something to consider.
You know, one of the things that concerned me about that is the amount of seed that is actually leaving the country in these exchanges. And I'll just raise that as a point, you know, that it's, we say there's a shortage in Australia, but there is also a lot of seed being exported.
The majority of seed that's being exported for us has been for plantation, for timber plantation.
Yep.
These days, it's just home gardeners wanting a few ukes and wattles in their backyard. We don't export as much native seed as what we used to, but I'm just thinking that that list for for tree and shrub seed within Australia could be utilised. You know, you don't have to put all of your species on there, of course. But yeah, it is just good to see where the seed is around Australia and, you know, provenance, if that's an option.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll take, it's time for a poll. So we're going to draw this session to a close. James is going to put the poll up. And this is just asking you where you see some of the constraints that are up there. So James, can you put the poll up, please? So the aim of this poll is just to pick your top 3 about, there are obviously ones we've discussed, we've captured them, but these are the ones that are in the poll. So just tell us what, this is looking at sources. Where do you see the top 3 constraints for you lying at the moment?
No. Oh, yes, sorry. Yep.
Okay, we've got 17 out of 26. So we'll just leave it open for a little bit longer. 21. We're stuck on 21. Give it another 10 seconds.
I caught that, Steve.
Lorena's supposed to mute me when I do things like that.
All right, I'm just ending the poll now. So number 1 issue was licensing and permitting.
Yes.
And then seed production area in public land was number 2, virtually equal, and then private land was seen as a lesser constraint. Excellent. All right, we're going to move on to quality now. I'm going to look at it through the lens of secure and supply, around a code of practice that is there. And then that will take us about 10 minutes. And then the rest of it, for those of you who've been involved in the earlier workshops, will be looking at the challenge and the comms and the dimensions that are there. So you're welcome to stay for that discussion, but for those who participate in that beforehand, you can also feel free to leave. I'll just share my slide screen again. So quality. Okay. So quality, look, quality underpins development. It requires a standard. It can be owned and used, but they need to be involved. And at a simple level, you can talk about it as being a mark. So this is like a brand that can signal quality, and also a code of practice that actually demonstrates that people are following the right procedures that are associated with it. And that could be procedures around the actual, collection and storage of seed and the use of seed. But it also can expand to business systems and a whole range of other things and introduce ethical and preference elements behind it. The driver behind quality seems to lie around viability, understanding provenance and also the source. The barriers that are quite often cited are cost, which standard to use and when not to use. I think the key thing here is, and this is what we need to discuss, is really it's the third question, well, there's a number of questions here, but do we need a national code of practice? And in the 3 workshops we've held today, that one's, everybody pretty much agrees that we need a code of practice. But when we talk about securing supply, do you think a code of practice could be an alternative to licensing and regulation? And do you think we could use a code of practice as a way of providing some labelling around native seed to demonstrate its qualities? Should it be voluntary, and will it create more red tape? I'm just going to push you back into your breakout groups for a quick discussion around this for 10 minutes, and then we'll bring it all back together. And Laura will put these questions in there. But I'd really like you to focus on, as an alternative to licensing and regulation, and also as a way of providing some labelling around seed as it's traded. So James, can you send us to our breakout rooms, please? Okay. Right, in the interest of time, welcome back everybody. Just waiting for the last few people to come back. What we're going to do now is we're going to do a quick poll on the code of practice questions. So James is going to put up a poll. And again, it's got those 5 questions that we had there, and we just want you to nominate them in order of priority. So James, can we put up the poll? Here we go. So this is a binary one. It's yes, no in relation to the 5 questions. So just one person's voted. 3 people have voted. 6, 7, 8. $18. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, let's have a look at the poll results. Okay, so nearly 100% on do we believe that we should have a national code of practice. Is it an alternative to current licensing and regulation? About 53% said yes. Do you think it should be voluntary or form of compliance? Form of compliance is about 47%. Do you think it could create more red tape for small business? The answer is yes. And do you support a code of practice as a form of labelling? And we've got 89% at yes. So I'll stop sharing the results and come back to the group. Oops. Okay, so now we've got 2 agenda items left. One is to look at what we call in the challenge, or the top end objective structure of the strategy. And finally, your communications about how you'd like to stay engaged with the strategy and Project Phoenix. So for those of you who've been involved in this in previous workshops, you're welcome to stay, but there's no need to. And if you go, thank you very much for your contributions today. So we didn't lose too many people in the process. But we've lost about, we're still going through it. I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Righto, so we're down to a dozen. I'm just going to share my screen again. And I've just got to, oops. Here we go. The challenge. So right at the top of the strategy, what a national strategy needs to do is really create a sense of ambition, of aspiration. And what we've done here is we've crafted 2 challenges, and we've chosen a challenge rather than an objective or a mission because there's a lot of uncertainty and things are really going to change over the next decade. And this is a 10-year strategy. So it's really challenge, and that gives you flexibility about what you're going to focus on rather than be programmatic in the approach. Here are the 2 challenges. The first challenge is seed banks continue to make the full diversity of Australian native plant species and their genetics available for posterity and active use. So this is about saying that, you know, we have a resource, a store of our plant diversity, and it's there just in case, but also so that we can use it. The second challenge is that the sector attracts the resources And by that, it's not only money, but it's also about people to sustain its skills and capacity to respond when required. So this is about saying that basically, you know, Native Seed is seen as a good place to be involved in, but also it has the ability to respond as it's required. So those are the two challenges. One is about the banks, the other one is about the capacity to respond. And James is going to put up a poll. And we just would like you to, and Laura's going to put the two challenges into the chat box in case you'd like to refer to them. Oops. So that, and we just want you to vote on them in terms of how much they inspire you and they think they act as a guiding light. So here's the poll up there. So challenge one is about the seed banks. The other one is the capacity, is the adaptive capacity. Just please rate it out of 5, where 1 is low and 5 is high, and how much it inspires you to be involved in developing the sector. We've got 5 out of 9 responses. 7 out of 9. Eight out of 9, I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, let me share the poll results with you. Okay, so if we look at the first one, 75% gave it 5, although there was 1, 2. And then when we look at the capacity one down the bottom, 63% said 5, but there's also a range of skills ratings that are below that. So thank you for that. I'm just intrigued around a couple of people who scored it a bit lower, just so that we can refine the challenges. What is it that made you score it a little bit lower?
Well, for me, being in the volunteer sector, everything's hard. So yeah, just hard to keep the enthusiasm going as the only employee at 1 day a week.
Mm. Thank you, Ali. Any other comments, or shall we move on?
And for me, I scored it low because I don't see that the seed, the Australian seed collecting industry is economically viable and not reimbursing enough for seed collectors' time. The seed is too cheap. Economically, it's not a viable market.
I think it's a very good point, Jay, and we were trying to capture that in the second vision, where we said going to attract the resources that needed, and implicit in that is that it's economically viable. But we'll work on the wording. That's really constructive feedback. Thank you. Any other final comments you'd like to make? What do you think, Rowena?
We all need native seed. It's a no-brainer.
Well, the workshop's called It's Better with Native Seeds. So
I'd hate to see exotics planted across our beautiful country.
What do you mean? We can have Paulownia plantations everywhere.
Asparagus plantations once upon a time, didn't we, Rowena?
Oh my God, didn't we?
Asparagus springeri was the main crop. The old seed collectors used to ring up seed merchants and say, have you ever heard of this plant called Pultonea villosa or whatever? And they never did they?
No. How it's changed.
Yeah, thank goodness.
All right, thank you for that. Now I'm going to pass over to James, and James is going to talk about just the communications going forward. So he'll lead the discussion on that, and then I'll be back for the wrap up.
Perfect, thanks JP. So as JP mentioned, we're here in a communications capacity currently for Project Phoenix, but we're also interested in getting an idea of how we can communicate and engage with you from the project to the right people in the right way at the right time. So just using the chat box down the bottom or top of your screen, it's probably on the bottom for you. If you could just put in the chat box your answers to the questions that are on screen now. So we'll start with that first one. So how would you like to be kept up to date as the project continues to develop? We've had some mixed answers on this one. There's been talk of portals, websites, newsletters, direct email. The world's your oyster basically with this. So let us know what form of communication works best for you and how you'd like to be kept up to date. Out a little bit there. Yep, so email's a common one.
Yeah, email.
And so a poll that I launch as well will go into detail about what kind of information you actually want. Is it stories? Is it research papers? Is it project updates? So we'll jump into that in a moment as well. So we'll jump onto this second question though for now, which is in line with the theme of today. So that being, who are the key people or who are the key stakeholder groups that we actually need to have an attitude or a shift with? So who are the key groups that need to be communicated with in order to get the outcomes we've been talking about in this session? So if in the chat box you could talk about who the key players we need to shift are, that would be great as well. Noting the comment of please no Facebook, LinkedIn or social media. It's fair enough. Could I ask Jay why that is? Has it just been overdone within the sector, or is it just not targeting the right audience in the right way?
To answer your question, have you looked at the fine print, the conditions of Facebook? Anything put on there, we lose copyright of, and they own the data.
So
there
it's
is
the
no
risk
privacy.
So behind that comment really is the risk of losing intellectual property, is it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And privacy. And lots of other reasons. If you've looked, I suggest you have a look at the fine print of all those places and have a look at actually who owns them. Because LinkedIn is, if I remember rightly, owned as the same as Facebook. And some of the others are cross-owned as well. Look at the fine print and you will realize why I don't support them. I don't touch them.
Absolutely. If you look at research institutions, so like ANU or UC, places like that, they do often have educational resources on social media in the form of an online article or things like that. You still don't see the value there?
Yes, it is fine for marketing and spam, but not for intellectual conversation and exchange of information.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a valuable insight. And so the final question that I'll get people to jump in the comments is what opportunities exist out there with the short lens and the long lens? What comms and engagement opportunities can we utilize to get better supply outcomes for the sector as a whole? Might be a publication, it might be an event, it might be a strategic partnership, but are there any kind of obvious opportunities that you think would really help the sector along? I'll give you a moment to enter that in the chat box. We've had quite a few mixed answers on this third question about the opportunities. They're everywhere from getting in touch with Costa on the ABC through to jumping into different magazines and kind of national and international conferences as well. So feel free to put any ideas in there. Yeah. Henty Machinery Field Days, good opportunity. Have a site there, even the Landcare building. With nurseries, selling native tube stock. Great. Some interesting conferences, councils and schools. Excellent. Perfect. Well, if you have any final thoughts on that, feel free to add it in the chat box. But for now, what I'll do is I'll launch a poll around specifically for Project Phoenix communications currently. Again, taking a short and long-term approach, just giving us some more insight into how you like to be communicated with. So I'll take that live. So we've got 9 voters left in the room, but I'll just stick with you for a minute or two while we get some answers up for this. So we've had 1 of 9 completed. 3 of 8. 4 of 8. 6 of 8. I'll just give it another 30 seconds or so. Great, 7 of 8. So I might stop it there. And I'll quickly just share those results as well. So this is quite typical of what we're finding. So the most effective channels are email, virtual event scores quite high, and often Project Phoenix website scores quite high as well. People like the idea of going to a certain location to get the information they need. In terms of the forms of information, it's mainly activity research updates and research papers. So it's largely that education and academic piece seems to be coming through quite strongly. The third question, it's generally been a 50-50 split on this one. So general updates as well as targeted information to benefit people's work. And monthly has been a clear sort of frequency for how often people want comms. So it's looking, it really sounds like a monthly newsletter or something like that might be valuable. So with that, I'll pass back over to JP to wrap up the session, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you everyone for participating. Sorry, JP, just on mute.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marina. So, okay, I'm just going to share with you the summary of the key points that came out with the discussion today. So, oops, share screen. So, what are some of the things that were raised in the discussion today? So, when we talked about the challenging of securing supply, there was the lack of collectors, educating buyers, storage, managing variable supply and demand, the permitting permissions, quantity, quality, poor lead time, over-collection, coordination, provenance limitations, lack of mechanisation, and unreliable disaggregated spatial information. Then Cameron led off a discussion around the poor awareness of the industry and you know, really that there is opportunity there. Also getting it incorporated to training and education. We had a discussion about the lack of access to sites as constraining the industry, and some of the inhibitors were royalties, understanding permit requirements and lead times, land clearing, and negotiating with landowners. The Indigenous groups is, you know, there's a real opportunity there, but we need to engage more. SPAs, seed production areas, the opportunity to improve coordination, that they are significant investments and they need a long-term security and to make them worthwhile. They need to be underpinned by science and be adaptable to changing needs or fashion and fads, as Rowena said. Connecting up seed banks is essential. There's a role there in buffering supply. There's issues around funding and recognising it's part of an overall system. codes of practice are seen as an alternative to some of the current approaches and could be used in compliance for access as well as labelling. But ultimately, for it to grow, then I suppose it has to become economically viable as an industry as well. So have I missed any key points?
No, you've done a great job.
Look, we've got a couple of minutes left, and there's one question we didn't ask you, and a few of you have been around for a few ones, and particularly with Rowena here. So the one question we didn't ask today was, who should own the strategy?
The industry.
But what do you mean by the industry? Because I thought the points you made early on were really good, Rowena, but I'm just trying to understand, when you say the industry, who?
We can become members and own the industry.
Because you spoke very, I thought, lucidly and in favour of it. Yet when some of the other sessions are people saying, oh, it's all too hard.
No, it's not too hard.
I like a can-do attitude.
Born into this industry. No, and you didn't come onto the code of practice, but we already have a code of practice for the sowing seed industry in Australia. So that's being reviewed at the moment, and that has the sector in there for native seed.
So the code of practice for what, Rowena? I'll just make sure I capture that.
The sowing seed industry. So under the Australian Seed Federation, if you're a member of the Australian Seed Federation, there is a code of practice for seed labelling and marketing. And once you become a member of the Australian Seed Federation, you have to adhere to the code of practice, which ties in with our arbitration. So if there's an issue between people within the industry, we can go to arbitration, and then they draw on the information out of the code of practice to arbitrate.
That was set up more than 30 years ago, isn't it, Rowena? And that's what we've all accorded to over these many years, that specific code of practice, because that's all we had, wasn't it, Rowena? And common sense and good practice is what we did.
So under the seed industry, we've got different sectors. So we've got tropicals, pastures, horticulture, and I'm pushing to have a native seed sector. There's currently only about 3 or 4 members who do native seeds. But look, everything is already there. We've already got a CEO. We've already got 2 other staff in the office in Canberra. We liaise directly with ministers from every department. Essentially, the core role of the ASF is to oversee the sowing seed sector in Australia. When Dad was assisting with the writing of the Flora Bank, we also then, don't know how much, whether it was before or after, that was when we wrote the code of practice for the industry, but it does have a small section in there for native seed.
It was the end of the writing of Flora Bank, because it was the second sort of tier was added. Do you think the number of native seed members, do you see it sort of a subset? Do you think it would attract more of people in the industry if it was a subset of
Definitely, look, I've already done an estimate, and I think there's between 25 and 30 native seed companies in Australia that could essentially join the ASF like we have, and then they represent me. So if I've got any issues importing, exporting, moving seed from state to state, seed cleaning, seed germination, they're there to assist me.
With the code of practice and the Flora Bank guidelines, as I said, they've been rewritten and in draft form, and they include the updated and extended code of practice. I'll get Lucy to send those through to you. I'll give Lucy your contact numbers and emails and get those sent through. But I'd be interested in feedback on whether there is anything left out of that code of practice, or any undue overlap, or can they merge together with the code of practice? Because I think it'd be really good if there's, well, obviously we need to talk and then discuss this route of action.
We
Yeah,
did
that-
actually have Greening Australia contact Osman Mewett, our CEO, last year about what the ASF does
I
and
know
how good.
Paul Gibson-Roy had been in contact
Yep.
with Greening when he was with Greening Australia.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we have discussed that when we're doing the national survey. I know that contact and the first workshop in 2016, it was discussed, and there was your CEO represented at that meeting and forum.
And look, I think the native seed sector is only going to grow. You know, as I've seen it I've been in the industry since the 80s, but it is growing. And I personally feel it's getting left behind because there's no one representing it. And that's really frustrating for me, because I look at how much my business sells of native seed to re-veg jobs and all this other work that we're doing. And there's no one policing what some of these rogue seed companies are doing. And
we're hearing you. Yeah, we're hearing.
Oh, and I
think we're all yeah. Look at I don't, in a sense, nothing is, you know, I said before that it's on a bit of a roundabout. In a sense, nothing is new, but opportunities are now much greater to do something with this. And I think your enthusiasm is admirable. And it'd be really, yeah, I think we have to all work together and find a pathway through this and not be too dogmatic, because I think a lot of these things are evolutions along a
yeah.
torturous route.
But there's only two other comments I want to make. I think you come into this industry because you're passionate about it.
Absolutely. You don't.
The native seed sector. You come to it because you're passionate about plants or seed or biodiversity or whatever it is. You know, the uniqueness of seed, how amazing they are. One little seed can produce a massive tree. But also, how I try to get people into seed picking for me, I say, money grows on trees.
Yep, I've said that for years. Yeah.
Look, I think this is a very important discussion we're having here, because ultimately there are, what we've heard throughout the 4 workshops that we run now, is there are a number of enterprises that are out there, and some are for profit and some of them are not for profit. It doesn't matter. Who have reached the level where they're willing to, you know, be very professional in how they approach this and come together around that. And I think that needs to be the basis of the representation. If you always go to the bottom and say that's got to be right first, then it's always going to be too hard. But it's really the formation around this, and the strategy is going to speak to this, to say it's really clear that developing a representative structure is important, because that's how you get a voice and that's how you progress issues, and just glue that and join the dots. The other thing we've heard through some of the breakout groups is, yeah, we're talking about the specifics of the strategy here, but people have just really got a lot out of hearing the different voices, and particularly what we've observed is some of the interface between the conservation and the what's called the restoration sector. So, you know, we're all doing it off seeds, but just the drivers are slightly different, and just sharing that information. People sent us feedback saying they found that really useful. So I think creating fora where information can exchange is important. But the other thing, and what tomorrow morning's about, is we also need a better demand signal. If this industry is to grow, and it came up in the early discussions today about supply, is unless people know that seed is needed, doesn't matter whether you're a volunteer or you do it for money, you can't commit to it as part of the process. So look, we're a minute past, so I just want to say thank you very much. I'm just going to put up one final slide. And that's to say thank you. All of the views that we've heard today in the previous workshops and the one coming will inform the strategy. If you want to get in touch with us or share any reflections or thoughts, you can email us at nativeseed@ACLAllen, or contact Laura directly, who's the project manager, and we'll take that gladly on board and answer any questions. So thank you. And for those of you who aren't joining us again, all the best, and we'll be in touch later on with the draft strategy. And those of you coming to some of the other workshops, which is we've got one more on demand, and then we're going to jurisdiction by jurisdiction approach. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow or soon thereafter.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.